He was standing at the altar when his phone rang, and that single call revealed a daughter he never knew existed and forced him to walk away from the wedding forever. The cathedral breathed with quiet luxury and expectation, every detail polished to perfection. Soft light filtered through stained glass windows, scattering colors across marble floors, while the low murmur of guests blended with the distant swell of music. Rows of people waited, smiling, whispering, certain they were about to witness the beginning of a flawless future. Cameras were ready. Headlines were already written in anticipation. Ethan Collins stood at the altar, his posture straight, his expression composed, a dark-haired, blue-eyed man who looked exactly like someone who had everything under control. His tailored suit fit him perfectly, as did the role he was playing. Successful. Confident. Unshakable. No one in the room could have guessed how detached he felt from the moment unfolding around him. He looked forward, not at his bride, but past her, his thoughts drifting somewhere far from the ceremony. He had agreed to this wedding because it made sense. Because it was expected. Because everyone around him had assured him that love would come later, that respect and stability were enough. He knew, with uncomfortable clarity, that he did not love the woman standing a few steps away from him, radiant and hopeful in white. He felt no panic about that realization, only a dull acceptance, as if he had already resigned himself to a life built on careful compromises. The priest spoke, his voice calm and practiced, but the words barely reached Ethan. He nodded at the right moments, responding automatically, his mind elsewhere. He wondered, briefly, whether this was what regret felt like, or whether regret came later, when it was too late to turn back. Then his phone vibrated in his pocket. The sensation was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it cut through him with startling force. His first instinct was irritation. Nothing was supposed to interrupt this moment. He shifted slightly, preparing to ignore it, when a second vibration followed, more insistent. Against his better judgment, he glanced down. The name on the screen erased every other thought in his mind. Rachel. For a fraction of a second, the cathedral disappeared. He was no longer standing at the altar. He was remembering a different life, a different version of himself, one that existed before ambition hardened him, before choices became strategies instead of feelings. He hadn't spoken her name in years. He had convinced himself that chapter was closed, buried, irrelevant. His heart began to race. The phone vibrated again, and something in his chest tightened with a sense of dread he could not explain. Rachel was not someone who called without reason. She never had been. Ethan hesitated, acutely aware of the eyes on him, the stillness of the room, the fragile balance of the moment. Ignoring the call would be easy. Acceptable. Expected. But his hand moved anyway, slow and deliberate, as if acting on instinct rather than logic. He answered. Ethan, her voice came through immediately, strained and trembling, barely holding together. I'm at the hospital. The word sent a sharp chill through him. What happened? He asked, lowering his voice, turning slightly away from the altar. There was a pause, heavy and uneven, as if she were gathering the strength to say something she had been carrying alone for far too long. There's a little girl, Rachel said finally. She's 4 years old. She has dark hair and blue eyes. She's yours. The world seemed to tilt. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone as the cathedral around him blurred into noise and color. He felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted without warning, opening a fault line straight through the life he was about to commit to. She needs surgery, Rachel continued, her voice breaking now. And I don't have the money. I wouldn't have called if there was any other way. Ethan said nothing. He couldn't. His breath felt shallow, uneven, his thoughts colliding too fast to form words. Somewhere nearby, the priest cleared his throat gently, waiting. His bride smiled nervously, sensing something wrong but not yet understanding what. Ethan looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since the ceremony began. In that moment, everything became painfully clear. The wedding. The expectations. The future he had chosen because it was easy. And somewhere in a hospital room, a child he had never known existed was fighting for her life. "I'm coming," he said into the phone, his voice low but steady. "I'll be there." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The cathedral was silent now, every gaze fixed on him, confusion rippling through the room. Ethan took one step back from the altar. And in that single movement, the life he had planned began to fall apart. Rachel's hands were shaking so badly she had to sit on them to keep from dropping the phone. The hospital corridor felt endless and painfully bright, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above her as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Nurses moved past her with practiced calm, their shoes squeaking against the floor, carrying charts in quiet urgency from one room to another. To them, this was another shift. To Rachel, it was the moment her life threatened to collapse completely. She stared at the closed door across the hall, where a small sign bore her daughter's name in neat black letters. Lily Howard. 4 years old. The door separated her from the steady beeping of machines and the thin, fragile body of a child who should have been running, laughing, asking too many questions about the world. Instead, Lily lay still beneath white sheets, dark hair spread across the pillow, her blue eyes closed in exhausted sleep after hours of pain. Rachel pressed her forehead against the cool wall and forced herself to breathe. She had sworn she would never call Ethan. That promise had been made years ago, forged in humiliation and heartbreak the night he walked away from her fear with a laugh. Back then, she had learned the hard way what it meant to be invisible to someone you loved. She had rebuilt herself piece by piece, learning how to survive alone, how to be strong for a child who depended on her for everything. But strength had limits. The doctor's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. Congenital complication. Surgery required. High risk without immediate treatment. The numbers he had spoken afterward had barely registered at first, until reality set in with crushing force. There was no charity that could act fast enough. No insurance that would cover what Lily needed. And time was something they did not have. Rachel looked down at her phone, at the call log showing Ethan's name. Her chest tightened with a mix of dread, resentment, and something dangerously close to hope. She hated herself for that last feeling more than anything else. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought this was another lie? What if he never came? A nurse approached gently. "She's stable for now," she said softly. "But we can't wait too long." Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you." When the nurse left, Rachel stood and walked slowly into Lily's room. The familiar antiseptic smell wrapped around her as she approached the bed. She brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's forehead, careful not to disturb the 4-line tape to her small hand. "Mommy?" Lily murmured, her eyes fluttering open. "I'm here," Rachel said immediately, forcing a smile that felt too heavy for her face. "I'm not going anywhere." Lily studied her with quiet seriousness that always struck Rachel as far older than 4 years. "My chest hurts," she whispered. Rachel's heart broke anew. "I know, sweetheart. The doctors are helping you." Lily nodded slowly, trusting without question, then closed her eyes again. Rachel stayed there for a long time, holding her daughter's hand, listening to the machines, letting memories surface despite her attempts to keep them buried. She remembered Ethan's blue eyes, so similar to Lily's, the way ambition had always pulled him forward, the way she had once believed love would be enough to keep him close. She wondered what kind of man he had become. Whether he had softened or hardened with success. Whether there was still room in him for compassion, or whether she had just torn open a door that should have remained closed forever. When she finally stepped back into the hallway, her phone buzzed. A message. "I'm on my way." Rachel stared at the screen until the words blurred. Her knees weakened, and she leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. Relief crashed into fear almost instantly. Ethan coming meant answers, consequences, and a reckoning she had postponed for 4 years. She wiped her tears, straightened her shoulders, and looked once more toward Lily's room. No matter what happened next, she reminded herself, she had done this for her daughter. Not for forgiveness. Not for reconciliation. For survival. And as the sound of hurried footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor, Rachel understood that the past was no longer something she could outrun. It was finally catching up to all of them. Ethan barely remembered leaving the cathedral. The echo of footsteps behind him, the stunned silence, the sound of his bride calling his name all blurred together into something distant and unreal. He moved on instinct alone, pushing through the heavy doors, breathing in the cold air outside as if it were the first real breath he had taken in years. His driver was already rushing toward him, confusion written across his face, but Ethan didn't stop to explain. He gave the hospital address with a voice that left no room for questions and slid into the back seat, his hands shaking for the first time in his adult life. As the car sped through the city, memories surfaced without mercy. Rachel's laugh from years ago, sharp and warm at the same time. The night she had told him she was pregnant, her voice quiet but brave. His own reaction replayed like a wound that refused to close, the careless dismissal, the arrogance, the certainty that his life was too important to be interrupted by inconvenient truths. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, staring at reflections of lights rushing past, and felt something inside him crack open. The hospital loomed ahead, bright and unforgiving. Ethan was already moving before the car fully stopped, ignoring the driver's attempt to follow. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and urgency. He asked for Lily Howard at the front desk, his voice controlled but tight, and was directed down a long corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him. Rachel saw him before he reached her. She stood slowly, her posture stiff, her green eyes locking onto his with an expression he could not immediately read. It wasn't anger. It wasn't relief. It was something heavier, something formed by years of doing everything alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You came," she said finally, her voice flat, almost disbelieving. "I came as fast as I could," Ethan replied. His eyes moved past her, toward the closed door behind her, toward the child he had only learned existed less than an hour ago. "Where is she?" Rachel hesitated, then stepped aside. "She's sleeping. The medication helps, but it won't last." Ethan nodded and followed her into the room. Lily lay small and pale against the white sheets, tubes and wires carefully arranged around her fragile body. Her dark hair curled softly against the pillow, and even in sleep, the resemblance struck him with brutal clarity. The shape of her face, the line of her lashes, the unmistakable blue of her eyes when they fluttered briefly before settling again. His eyes. His knees nearly gave out. He reached the side of the bed slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly might break something irreversible. He did not touch her at first. He simply looked, breathing shallowly, absorbing the reality that this child existed because of him, and that he had not been there for a single day of her life. "She's 4, Rachel said quietly behind him. "She loves drawing and refuses to sleep without the light on. She hates broccoli and asks too many questions." Ethan closed his eyes. Each detail felt like a reminder of everything he had missed. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, though the question felt hollow even as he spoke it. Rachel crossed her arms, not defensively, but to hold herself together. "I did," she said. "You didn't listen. After that, I decided she deserved better than being an inconvenience." He turned to face her, guilt flooding his chest so violently it hurt to breathe. "I was wrong," he said. "About everything." Rachel let out a short, tired breath. "Being right now doesn't change the past." "I know," Ethan said. "But let me change this. Whatever she needs, I'll cover it. The surgery, the doctors, everything." Rachel studied his face, searching for conditions, for hesitation, for the man who had once laughed at her fear. She found none of that. Only panic, regret, and something raw and unguarded. "I didn't call you for money," she said carefully. "I called you because she's running out of time." Ethan nodded immediately. "Then we won't waste another second." A nurse entered quietly, updating them on Lily's condition, explaining procedures and timelines. Ethan listened intently, asking questions, absorbing every word as if his attention alone could protect her. When the costs were mentioned, he didn't flinch. He signed forms without reading them, his signature firm despite the chaos inside him. Later, when the nurse left, Ethan finally reached out and gently took Lily's small hand in his. The warmth of her skin sent a jolt through him, grounding and devastating all at once. "I'm here," he whispered, unsure whether she could hear him or not. "I'm not going anywhere." Rachel watched from a few steps away, her expression guarded but shaken. She had prepared herself for anger, for denial, for indifference. What she hadn't prepared for was the sight of Ethan Collins standing helplessly beside a hospital bed, stripped of power and certainty, learning in a single night what love actually demanded. And as Lily shifted slightly in her sleep, tightening her fingers around his without waking, Ethan understood that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. Morning came quietly, filtered through the thin hospital curtains in pale shades of gray and gold. Ethan had not slept. He remained in the chair beside Lily's bed, his jacket folded over the back, his shirt wrinkled, his mind unwilling to rest even when his body begged for it. Every small movement Lily made pulled his attention instantly back to her, as if she might disappear if he looked away for even a second. Rachel watched him from across the room as she poured herself a cup of stale hospital coffee. She looked exhausted, her dark auburn hair slipping loose from its tie, shadows settling beneath her green eyes. She had lived like this for days already, running on fear and instinct, but seeing Ethan here now complicated everything in ways she had not prepared for. "You should go home," she said quietly. "Change, at least." "I'm not leaving," Ethan replied without hesitation. His voice was calm, but there was something immovable beneath it. "Not today." Rachel studied him for a long moment, then looked away. She had learned long ago that arguing with a determined man like Ethan was pointless, yet this version of him felt unfamiliar. Gone was the arrogance, the effortless authority. What stood in front of her now was a man stripped down to something raw and uncertain. The doctor arrived mid-morning, accompanied by a nurse carrying a clipboard thick with documents. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with practiced precision, explaining the risks, the procedure, the narrow window they had before Lily's condition could worsen. Rachel listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Ethan absorbed every detail with intense focus. "She needs surgery within the next 48 hours, the doctor concluded. "The sooner, the better." Ethan nodded once. "Do whatever you need to do." Rachel looked at him sharply. "It's not that simple." Ethan met her gaze. "It is. I'll take responsibility for all of it." There was a brief pause, heavy with unspoken history. "This doesn't buy you forgiveness," Rachel said quietly. "I know," Ethan answered. "I'm not trying to buy anything." When the doctor left, silence filled the room again, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitor. Lily stirred, her eyes fluttering open slowly. She frowned, disoriented, then noticed Ethan sitting beside her. "Mommy," she murmured. "I'm right here," Rachel said instantly, moving closer. Lily's gaze shifted back to Ethan, studying his face with innocent curiosity. "Who are you?" The question struck deeper than any accusation ever could. Ethan swallowed, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He did not look at Rachel for permission. He did not invent a lie. "My name is Ethan," he said softly. "I'm someone who should have been here a long time ago." Lily considered this, then nodded as if that explanation was enough for now. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel turned away, blinking rapidly. She had imagined this moment in her worst nightmares, feared it, delayed it, but seeing it unfold so simply, so gently, unraveled something inside her. Later that afternoon, while Lily slept again, Rachel and Ethan stood in the hallway outside her room. The hospital hummed around them, indifferent and relentless. "You left," Rachel said suddenly, her voice low but sharp. "You didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from a future you didn't even bother to ask about." Ethan did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. "I was a coward," he said when she finished. "I chose ambition because it didn't need me to feel anything. And I convinced myself that made me strong." Rachel's jaw tightened. "And now?" "Now I know strength is staying when everything tells you to run." She laughed quietly, without humor. "You don't get redemption just because you figured that out too late." "I know," Ethan said again. "But Lily doesn't deserve to pay for who I used to be." Rachel looked at him then, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected to see so clearly. Not confidence. Not control. Fear. Fear of losing a child he had only just met, fear of being unworthy of her, fear of failing again. "I'm not promising you anything," Rachel said. "Not trust. Not forgiveness. Not a place in our lives." "I'm not asking for promises," Ethan replied. "Just don't shut the door." She hesitated, then nodded once. "We'll see." As evening settled in and the hospital lights dimmed, Ethan returned to Lily's bedside, taking her small hand again as if it were the most fragile and important thing he had ever held. Rachel watched from the doorway, her heart heavy and conflicted. She had called him because she had no choice. She had never imagined he would answer by staying. And somewhere between fear and hope, she realized that the hardest part of all was just beginning. The hours before the surgery stretched endlessly, bending time into something heavy and oppressive. Ethan stayed close to Lily's bed, rising only when nurses needed space, his attention fixed on every shift of her expression, every subtle change in the rhythm of the machines. He had spent years making decisions that moved markets and altered lives at a distance, but none of that experience prepared him for the helplessness of waiting beside a small hospital bed with nothing to offer but presence. Rachel tried to keep herself busy, organizing paperwork, answering questions from doctors, pretending that control still existed somewhere within reach. Every so often her eyes drifted back to Ethan, as if she needed to confirm that he was still there, that this wasn't another cruel illusion created by exhaustion and fear. He was quieter than she remembered, more restrained, as if every word now carried weight he was afraid to misuse. When the nurse finally arrived to take Lily for pre-op, the moment shattered what little composure Rachel had left. Lily clung to her hand, her small fingers tightening instinctively as the bed began to move. "Mommy, don't go," she whispered, panic flickering in her blue eyes. "I'm right here," Rachel said quickly, leaning close, pressing her forehead gently to Lily's. "I'll be waiting when you wake up. I promise." Lily nodded uncertainly, then turned her head toward Ethan, who stood frozen at the foot of the bed, fear written openly across his face. "Will you stay too?" she asked. The question broke him. "I'll be right outside," Ethan said, his voice rough but steady. "I'm not leaving." She seemed satisfied with that, her grip loosening just slightly as the nurses began to will her away. Rachel followed until the doors marked restricted closed between them, the soft click of the lock sounding far louder than it should have. The waiting room felt too small, too bright, filled with strangers living out their own quiet emergencies. Rachel sat rigidly in one of the plastic chairs, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Ethan stood at first, pacing in short, controlled movements, then eventually sat beside her, close enough to feel her tension but not touching her without invitation. Minutes passed. Then hours. No one spoke much. Words felt inadequate, even intrusive. Occasionally a nurse would pass by, offering brief updates, nothing definitive, nothing comforting enough to ease the knot in Rachel's chest. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every fragment of information as if it were oxygen. At one point, Rachel's control finally cracked. Her shoulders began to shake, silent tears spilling over despite her efforts to remain composed. Without thinking, Ethan reached out, then hesitated, his hand hovering uncertainly in the space between them. Rachel noticed and gave a small nod. He placed his hand over hers, warm and steady, not squeezing, not pulling her closer, simply anchoring her in the moment. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. The quiet support was enough. "This is my fault," he said softly after a long silence. "If I had been here, if I had known sooner." Rachel shook her head weakly. "No," she said. "This happened whether you were here or not. Don't take that from me too. I won't let guilt be the only thing that brings you closer to her." Ethan nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. "Then let it be love," he said quietly. "Even if I'm learning it too late." The surgeon finally appeared as evening settled in, his expression tired but composed. Rachel stood so abruptly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Ethan rose beside her, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "The surgery went as planned," the doctor said carefully. "There were complications, but we managed them. She's stable for now." Rachel's legs nearly gave out. She covered her mouth, a sob escaping before she could stop it. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, relief flooding through him so powerfully it left him dizzy. "You can see her soon," the doctor continued. "She'll be in recovery for a while." When they were finally allowed into the room, Lily lay pale and still, surrounded by tubes and monitors once again, but this time the danger had shifted from immediate to uncertain. Rachel went to her side instantly, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead, whispering reassurances even though Lily was still unconscious. Ethan stood back for a moment, watching them, understanding with painful clarity how much ground he had to make up. Then Lily stirred slightly, her fingers twitching as if searching. Ethan stepped closer, carefully, and offered his hand. Her small fingers wrapped around it weakly, instinctively. Rachel looked up at him then, her eyes red and exhausted, and for the first time she didn't pull away. That night, as the hospital settled into uneasy quiet, Ethan remained seated beside Lily's bed, refusing to leave even when Rachel urged him to rest. He watched over her, holding her hand, learning the shape of a love that demanded nothing but presence and patience. And as he sat there in the dim light, Ethan understood that the surgery had not only changed Lily's future. It had irrevocably changed his own, stripping away the life he had planned and replacing it with one he had never known he needed. The days after the surgery moved in a strange, uneven rhythm, measured not by clocks but by Lily's breathing, by the numbers on the monitors, by the cautious expressions of doctors who refused to promise too much too soon. Recovery was not dramatic or immediate. It came slowly, in fragile increments that demanded patience Ethan had never been forced to learn before. Lily slept most of the time, her small body exhausted from the fight it had endured. When she woke, it was only for minutes at first, her eyes unfocused, her voice barely a whisper. Rachel never left her side for long. She learned every sound the machines made, every shift in Lily's expression, her nerves constantly stretched tight with the fear that something could go wrong again at any moment. Ethan stayed too. At first, it felt almost unreal to Rachel, seeing him there every morning when she arrived and every night when she finally allowed herself to rest. He brought coffee she rarely drank, food she forgot to eat, and paperwork she didn't have the strength to face. He spoke little, choosing instead to listen, to observe, to make himself useful without imposing. The man who once commanded entire rooms now waited quietly in hospital corridors, asking permission before sitting, before touching, before saying anything at all. On the third day, Lily opened her eyes fully for the first time since the operation. Rachel noticed immediately, her breath catching as she leaned forward. "Sweetheart," she whispered. Lily blinked slowly, her blue eyes cloudy with fatigue, then focused on Rachel's face. "Mommy," she murmured. Tears spilled down Rachel's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Lily's gaze drifted past her, settling on Ethan, who stood a few steps away, frozen in place as if afraid to move. "You stayed," Lily said quietly. The words were simple, innocent, and devastating all at once. "Yes," Ethan answered, his voice thick. "I stayed." She studied him for a long moment, then gave a faint nod, as if confirming something to herself. "Okay," she said, closing her eyes again. That single word hit him harder than any accusation ever could. Later that day, the doctor pulled Ethan and Rachel aside. He explained the road ahead carefully, outlining follow-up treatments, restrictions, and the long-term outlook. The danger had passed, but Lily's recovery would require time, monitoring, and consistency. It was not something that could be solved quickly or cheaply. Ethan didn't hesitate. "Whatever she needs," he said. "I'll handle it." Rachel stiffened slightly. "This isn't a transaction," she said quietly once the doctor left. "I know," Ethan replied immediately. "And I'm not trying to make it one. I just want to take responsibility." She searched his face, wary of old patterns, of grand gestures meant to erase guilt. What she found instead was exhaustion and resolve, neither of which could be faked easily. That evening, when Lily was resting comfortably, Rachel finally allowed herself to sit down in the small family lounge across the hall. The tension she had carried for days began to seep out of her, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. Ethan joined her a few minutes later, sitting across from her, his posture unguarded. "I need to say something," Rachel said quietly. "And I need you to listen." He nodded. "I will." "You don't get to step in and rewrite her life," she continued. "You don't get to be the hero who shows up at the last moment and fixes everything. Lily doesn't need saving. She needs stability." "I understand," Ethan said. "And I'm not asking to take over. I just want to be here. However you'll allow it." Rachel let out a slow breath. "Being here means more than hospital rooms," she said. "It means showing up when things are boring, and hard, and ungrateful. It means being there even when she doesn't need you anymore." Ethan didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was steady. "That's the part I'm most afraid of failing." Rachel looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she didn't see the man who had laughed at her fear. She saw someone confronting the consequences of his choices without trying to escape them. The press began circling soon after. Calls came in, messages piling up, rumors spreading about the wedding that never happened and the hospital he had disappeared into. Ethan ignored them all. When his assistant finally reached him, warning of fallout, of board members demanding answers, he ended the call with a single sentence. "I'll deal with it later." For the first time in his life, later mattered less than now. That night, Rachel found him asleep in the chair beside Lily's bed, his head tilted awkwardly, one hand still holding Lily's fingers. The sight tightened her chest in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. She covered him with her jacket anyway. Standing there in the dim light, watching her daughter breathe steadily while the man who had once broken her now kept vigil beside her, Rachel understood something with painful clarity. Healing was not just happening in Lily's body. It was beginning to happen in all of them. The outside world did not remain silent for long. It never did when someone like Ethan Collins stepped out of line. By the end of the week, his name was everywhere, whispered through hospital corridors by strangers who pretended not to stare, splashed across screens and headlines that reduced the most painful moments of his life to sharp, clickable phrases. The abandoned bride. The vanished groom. The secret child. The hospital. Rachel saw the first article by accident, a notification lighting up her phone while she waited for coffee in the hospital cafeteria. She didn't open it at first. She already knew the shape of the story it would tell, and she hated how easily the world could turn private fear into public spectacle. Still, the weight of it pressed on her chest, a familiar reminder that nothing involving Ethan would ever be simple. Ethan read everything. He sat alone in a quiet corner near Lily's room, scrolling slowly, absorbing every accusation and speculation without reacting. He did not call his lawyers. He did not issue statements. For once, he did not try to control the narrative. The truth, messy and incomplete as it was, mattered more to him now than reputation ever had. The board of directors called that afternoon. He took the call outside, pacing the narrow courtyard behind the hospital, listening as familiar voices spoke in careful tones about responsibility, image, and damage control. They asked him when he planned to return. They asked how long this situation would last. They asked, without saying it directly, whether the child was worth the fallout. Ethan closed his eyes. "I won't leave," he said simply. There was a pause on the line, thick and uncomfortable. "You're throwing everything away," one of them said finally. "No," Ethan replied. "I'm choosing something I should have chosen a long time ago." He ended the call before they could respond. When he returned inside, Rachel was standing by Lily's bed, helping her sip water carefully. Lily looked stronger now, color slowly returning to her cheeks, her eyes more alert. She smiled faintly when she saw Ethan, a small, tired smile that felt like a victory. "Daddy," she said softly, testing the word as if unsure whether it would stay. The sound of it hit him harder than any headline ever could. He nodded, unable to trust his voice, and sat down beside her, taking her hand. Rachel watched them, her emotions tangled and conflicted. She had spent years protecting Lily from absence and disappointment, teaching herself not to rely on anyone who could disappear. Watching Ethan step so fully into this role scared her more than his earlier cruelty ever had. Hope was dangerous. Hope asked for trust. That evening, after Lily fell asleep, Rachel finally confronted him. "You're blowing up your life," she said quietly, standing near the window where the city lights blurred into soft streaks. "And I didn't ask you to." "I know," Ethan replied. "I'm not doing this for gratitude." "Then why?" she asked, her voice tight. "Because every time I think about leaving," he said, "I see her face. And I remember how easy it was for me to walk away before. I won't do that again." Rachel turned to face him fully. "And when this gets harder? When she's better and you don't feel needed anymore?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "That's when staying matters most." She searched his face for arrogance, for certainty that might crumble later. What she saw instead was fear, honest and unshielded, and something deeper beneath it, a commitment that did not depend on applause or forgiveness. Lily was discharged 2 days later. Walking out of the hospital felt surreal. The sunlight seemed too bright, the air too open after weeks of enclosed fear. Ethan carried Lily carefully, her arms wrapped loosely around his neck, while Rachel followed beside them, her steps unsteady with relief and exhaustion. Cameras flashed from a distance, voices called out questions, but Ethan didn't look back. He placed Lily gently into the car and closed the door as if sealing the world out. At Rachel's apartment, life began again in small, tentative steps. Medication schedules replaced hospital monitors. Quiet naps replaced alarms. Ethan stayed, sleeping on the couch, helping with meals, learning routines that had never included him before. He didn't announce his intentions or ask for reassurance. He simply showed up each morning and remained each night. One evening, as Lily colored at the table, she looked up suddenly. "Are you going away again?" she asked, her voice careful. Ethan crouched beside her, meeting her eyes. "No," he said. "I'm staying." She considered this, then nodded and returned to her drawing, satisfied. Rachel turned away quickly, blinking back tears she hadn't expected. She realized then that whatever came next, whatever pain or healing awaited them, the hardest choice had already been made. Ethan Collins had walked away from an altar once. This time, he was not walking away at all. Life after the hospital did not rush forward in dramatic leaps. It unfolded slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether this fragile new reality was strong enough to hold. The apartment felt smaller now with Ethan in it, but also warmer, filled with sounds Rachel had never allowed herself to imagine before. Morning footsteps that weren't hers alone. Quiet conversations over breakfast. Laughter drifting down the hallway when Lily insisted on telling the same story twice. Recovery demanded patience. Lily tired easily, her body still learning how to trust itself again. Some days she woke up smiling, eager to draw or sit by the window and watch people pass below. Other days she clung to Rachel, overwhelmed by sudden waves of exhaustion or fear that came without warning. Ethan learned those rhythms quickly. He learned when to step in and when to stay back, when to distract and when to simply sit beside her in silence, letting her small hand rest in his. Rachel watched him constantly, even when she pretended not to. She noticed how he memorized medication schedules without being asked, how he set alarms on his phone for doctor appointments, how he adjusted his entire life without complaint or announcement. There were no grand speeches, no attempts to define what they were or what they might become. Just consistency, steady and unassuming. The consequences of Ethan's choice arrived quietly but firmly. His absence from public life became permanent. The company announced his resignation in carefully worded statements, the press speculating endlessly about scandal and downfall. Offers came anyway, lucrative and tempting, but Ethan declined most of them, choosing smaller projects he could manage without disappearing for days at a time. For the first time, success was measured not by growth or profit, but by presence. Rachel struggled with the shift more than she expected. She had built herself around independence, around the belief that needing no one was the safest way to survive. Allowing Ethan into their lives meant allowing uncertainty, vulnerability, and the terrifying possibility of loss. Some nights she lay awake, listening to the quiet apartment, wondering if she was foolish to believe this could last. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch with crayons still clutched in her hand, Rachel and Ethan sat together in the dim light of the living room. The city hummed softly outside, distant and indifferent. "I don't know how to trust this," Rachel admitted finally. "I don't know how to trust you without losing myself." Ethan didn't rush to answer. He had learned that silence mattered. "You don't have to trust the future," he said carefully. "Just the present. Just today." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw no urgency in his expression, no demand. Only patience. Weeks turned into months. Lily grew stronger, her laughter returning in full, her step steadier, her curiosity boundless. She started preschool again, proudly telling anyone who would listen about her drawings, her favorite colors, and her dad who picked her up every afternoon. The word dad settled into their lives naturally, without ceremony, becoming part of the everyday language of home. Rachel noticed when it stopped hurting to hear it. On the anniversary of Lily's surgery, they went to the park together. The day was warm, sunlight filtering through the trees as Lily ran across the grass, her dark hair flying behind her, her blue eyes bright with life. Ethan watched her with quiet intensity, every movement a reminder of what could have been lost. "She's happy," Rachel said softly, standing beside him. Ethan nodded. "That's all that matters." Lily ran back to them, breathless and smiling, grabbing both of their hands at once. "Come play," she demanded. They followed her, awkward and laughing, leaving behind the weight of everything that had nearly destroyed them. That night, after Lily was asleep, Rachel stood at the window while Ethan washed dishes in the small kitchen. The reflection of the room stared back at her, different from the lonely version she remembered. She turned slowly. "I don't regret calling you," she said. "Even though I was afraid." Ethan dried his hands and met her gaze. "I don't regret answering." She hesitated, then stepped closer, not into his arms, but into the shared space between them that no longer felt empty. "We move slowly," she said. "For her. And for me." He nodded. "As slow as you need." Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, unaware of the quiet miracle taking shape inside a modest apartment. No headlines followed them now. No grand declarations marked their ending. There was only a man who chose to stay, a woman who chose to allow it, and a child who ran freely into a future that almost never happened. Sometimes one phone call changes everything. And sometimes, choosing not to run is what finally makes a life whole. At a charity gala filled with wealth and applause, Ethan Harper thought he was about to give another forgettable speech, until 3 6-year-old girls with his eyes stepped in front of him and quietly destroyed everything he thought he knew about his life. The charity gala filled the grand ballroom with soft music, polite laughter, and the muted sparkle of wealth that no longer impressed Ethan Harper. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, waiters moved silently between guests, and cameras flashed every few seconds, capturing smiles that were rehearsed and empty. Ethan stood near the edge of the room with a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, nodding automatically as donors congratulated him on another successful year. He was used to this world. Comfortable in it. And completely detached from it. He had just finished a brief speech about hope, responsibility, and giving back when he felt an unexpected stillness behind him, as if the air itself had changed. Someone tugged gently at his jacket. He turned. In front of him stood 3 little girls. They were small, no more than 6 years old, standing shoulder to shoulder as if drawing courage from one another. They wore simple but elegant dark blue dresses, clearly chosen with care, and their brown hair was neatly braided in the same way, almost painfully identical. What struck him hardest were their eyes. Blue. The exact shade he saw every morning in the mirror. For a moment, Ethan thought his mind was playing a cruel trick on him. He blinked, once, then again. The girls didn't disappear. What? I have children? He asked, his voice low and unsteady, barely audible over the music. The words slipped out before he could stop them. He hadn't meant to say them aloud. The guests nearby fell silent, sensing something unusual. Ethan barely noticed. His attention was locked on the three faces staring up at him with a mixture of fear, hope, and exhaustion far beyond their years. One of the girls stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was calm, rehearsed, as if she had practiced these words many times. "Our mom died," she said. Her name was Emma. The name hit him like a physical blow. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, but no one reacted. Ethan felt as though the room had narrowed, the walls pressing inward, leaving no space to breathe. Before he could respond, the girl reached into a small worn purse and pulled out a photograph. She held it up carefully, as if it were something sacred. Ethan recognized it instantly. He was younger in the picture, thinner, smiling in a way he hadn't smiled in years. His arm was wrapped around a woman with gentle eyes and an unmistakable curve to her belly. Emma. Alive. Radiant. Pregnant. His heart dropped so suddenly it felt like falling from a great height. "She said you were our father," another girl added quietly. "She said we should find you if anything ever happened to her." Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His mind raced, searching for logic, for denial, for any explanation that would make this moment unreal. Years of carefully controlled emotions cracked open all at once. "This isn't possible," he finally said, shaking his head. "She would have told me. She would have found me." The third girl, the smallest of the three, looked up at him with eyes far too serious for a child. "She tried," she said. "You just weren't there." Around them, the charity gala continued, unaware that a man who had built an empire in silence and solitude had just watched his entire world collapse and reform in the span of a single breath. Ethan left the gala early that night, something he had never done before. The reporters noticed, the donors whispered, and his assistant sent a dozen unanswered messages to his phone, but none of it mattered. The image of three identical blue eyes followed him out into the cold night, burned into his thoughts so deeply that even the city lights blurred as his driver pulled away from the building. He didn't go home. Instead, he sat alone in the back seat of the car, staring at the photograph the girls had given him, turning it over and over in his hands as if the truth might change depending on the angle. Emma's smile in the picture was soft and unguarded, the kind of smile she had only shown when she thought no one was watching. He remembered the night it had been taken, the cheap diner, the laughter, the promise that tomorrow would be better. He remembered how young and reckless he had been, how convinced he was that he had time. Emma Wilson. The name echoed through his memory, unlocking doors he had kept sealed for a decade. Back then, he wasn't a billionaire or a public figure. He was just a man with a failing startup, sleepless nights, and a constant fear of losing everything. Emma had been working double shifts as a waitress, studying at night, dreaming of a future she refused to believe was out of reach. She had challenged him, argued with him, believed in him when no one else did. Loving her had felt dangerous, because she saw through him too easily. Then everything collapsed. His business partner disappeared with their remaining funds, leaving Ethan on the edge of ruin. Lawsuits followed. Creditors circled. Panic consumed him, and instead of fighting, he ran. He told himself it was temporary, that once he rebuilt his life, he would come back for her. But weeks turned into months, and pride hardened into silence. He changed his number. He stopped checking his old email. He convinced himself that disappearing was an act of protection, not abandonment. Sitting in the dark car, Ethan finally opened his phone and searched her name. The results were brief and devastating. An obituary. Modest. Almost invisible. Emma Wilson, loving mother of 3 daughters, remembered for her kindness and quiet strength. Mother of 3. His chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. When he arrived at his penthouse, the space felt unbearably empty. The walls were clean, expensive, and lifeless, offering no comfort. He poured himself a drink and didn't touch it, then sank onto the couch with the photograph still clutched in his hand. He tried to calculate timelines, to find a flaw in the story, but every memory aligned too perfectly. The months. Her sudden silence. The way she had looked at him the last time they spoke, as if she wanted to say something and couldn't find the words. He remembered her messages now, the ones he had ignored. The emails he had never opened. The voicemails he had deleted without listening because he had been afraid of what they might ask from him. Sometime after midnight, a soft knock broke the silence of the apartment. Ethan froze. For a brief, irrational moment, he thought it might be Emma standing on the other side of the door, alive and angry and real. Instead, when he opened it, he found his legal advisor, pale and visibly shaken. The children, the man said carefully. Social services contacted us. They don't have a legal guardian. Ethan closed his eyes. The truth was no longer something he could debate or deny. It had a shape now, names, faces, and consequences. Somewhere in the city, 3 little girls were alone, grieving a mother he had once loved, carrying a truth he had been too afraid to face. And for the first time in 10 years, Ethan Harper understood that success had not saved him from the past. It had only delayed the moment when it would finally demand to be answered. The office where Ethan had signed billion-dollar contracts felt smaller than ever as he sat across from the social worker, his lawyers, and a court-appointed counselor. The walls of glass that once symbolized transparency and power now made him feel exposed, as if every mistake of his past were etched into them. On the table between them lay a thin folder containing documents that somehow weighed more than any financial report he had ever reviewed. The DNA results were clear. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no legal language to soften the truth. Olivia Harper. Lily Harper. Sophie Harper. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Ethan stared at the names until the letters blurred, a strange mixture of disbelief and certainty twisting in his chest. This was not a rumor, not an accusation, not a nightmare he could wake up from. This was his life, rearranged without his permission. You are their biological father, the counselor said gently, watching his reaction. But legally, they are considered wards of the state until custody is determined. Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were far away. He was remembering birthdays he had never attended, scraped knees he had never kissed better, bedtime stories that had been read by someone else or perhaps not read at all. 6 years of absence suddenly felt heavier than all the years of work that had built his empire. When the meeting ended, he didn't return to the boardroom or his private office. Instead, he walked down a quiet hallway and locked himself into a small conference room no one ever used anymore. He sat alone at the long table, his elbows resting on the polished surface, and for the first time in years, his control shattered. The tears came silently at first, then uncontrollably, grief and regret spilling out without resistance. No press release had prepared him for this. No strategy could undo it. Later that afternoon, he visited the temporary foster facility where the girls were staying. The building was clean but impersonal, painted in cheerful colors that couldn't hide the sadness beneath them. When the door opened, Olivia, Lily, and Sophie stood together again, as if the world required them to remain united at all times. They recognized him instantly. Olivia's eyes lit up with cautious relief, Lily studied him as if memorizing every detail, and Sophie stayed half a step behind the others, gripping her sister's hand. "I signed the papers," Ethan said quietly, lowering himself to their level. "You can stay with me. For now." There was no excitement in their faces, only uncertainty. Sophie finally spoke, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Are you going to leave us too?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. Ethan felt it settle in his chest, heavy and sharp, because he had no perfect answer to give. He could promise safety, money, comfort, but trust was something he hadn't earned. "No," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I won't. Not again." The girls exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them, and then Lily nodded once, as if accepting a temporary truce with fate. That night, Ethan prepared the guest rooms himself, refusing the help of his staff. He stood in the doorway long after the girls had fallen asleep, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing, overwhelmed by the fragile reality of their presence. His penthouse no longer felt empty, but it didn't feel like home either. It felt like a second chance that could be taken away at any moment. As he turned off the lights and closed the door, Ethan understood something with terrifying clarity. Being their father was not a title confirmed by a test or a court document. It was a promise he would have to keep every single day, knowing that one broken word could hurt them more than his absence ever had. Ethan did not sleep that night. After the girls were settled with a temporary caregiver in the apartment, he sat at his desk as dawn crept slowly through the windows, surrounded by silence and unanswered questions. Knowing they were safe under his roof did nothing to ease the ache in his chest. If anything, it made the absence of their mother more real, more unbearable. He realized that before he could move forward with them, he needed to understand what had happened to Emma, not as a headline or a memory, but as the truth she had lived with alone. The next morning, he instructed his legal team to obtain her medical records and contact the hospital listed in the obituary. He expected resistance, bureaucracy, delays, but the process was disturbingly simple. Emma had no spouse, no listed partner, and no one powerful enough to shield her history. By the afternoon, Ethan found himself sitting in a quiet consultation room across from an oncologist who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Stage 4, the doctor said carefully, folding his hands. "By the time we diagnosed it, treatment would have been aggressive and uncertain." Ethan stared at the floor, listening to details he wished he could erase. Chemotherapy. Pain. Months of weakness that she had hidden while raising 3 children on her own. She was offered assistance, the doctor continued. Private charities, hospital programs. She declined all of it. Ethan looked up sharply. "Why?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "She said she didn't want anyone contacting you on her behalf. She was very clear about that." The words settled heavily between them. Ethan thanked the doctor, though he wasn't sure why, and left the hospital feeling as if every step pulled him deeper into something irreversible. Emma had been dying, and she had still chosen silence over help, pride over survival, protecting him even when he didn't deserve it. That evening, he visited the small apartment where Emma had lived. It was modest, cramped, filled with signs of careful budgeting and quiet love. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator, shoes were neatly lined by the door, and the air still carried the faint scent of laundry detergent and something floral. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused. A social worker handed him a box labeled simply with her name. "Personal belongings," she said. She asked that these be given to you if you were ever found. His hands shook as he opened it later, sitting alone on the floor. Inside were folded letters he had never read, photographs he had never taken, and at the very bottom, a worn notebook with softened edges. Her diary. He hesitated before opening it, knowing that once he did, there would be no distance left between them. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, sometimes neat, sometimes rushed, chronicling exhaustion, fear, and determination. She wrote about the girls' first smiles, their first steps, the nights she cried quietly in the bathroom so they wouldn't hear. And she wrote about him. Not with bitterness. Not with anger. She wrote about missing him, about hoping he was safe, about telling the girls stories of a father who was strong and kind, even when she didn't know if he still remembered her. Near the end, the handwriting weakened. "If you ever read this," one entry said, "please don't feel guilty. Loving you was never a mistake. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to be the reason you came back out of obligation. I wanted you to choose happiness, even if it wasn't with me." Ethan closed the notebook, his vision blurred with tears he no longer tried to hide. He stood abruptly and crossed the room to the mirror, staring at the man reflected back at him, a man who had built everything except the one thing that mattered. He raised his fist and struck the glass. The sound echoed sharply through the apartment, a clean crack splitting his reflection down the middle. Blood ran from his knuckles, but he didn't feel it. All he felt was the unbearable truth that Emma had carried her pain alone, believing he was better off without knowing. That night, when he returned home, Ethan stood quietly in the doorway of the girls' room. They were asleep, tangled in blankets, breathing softly, unaware of the storm of guilt and love reshaping their father's heart. He understood then that learning the truth about Emma was not the end of his grief, but the beginning of a promise he could never break. Time passed unevenly after Emma's truth came to light, moving too fast on some days and painfully slow on others. Ethan tried to build routines for the girls, believing structure might make the unfamiliar feel safer. Mornings became quieter, breakfasts slightly chaotic, evenings filled with hesitant conversations and carefully chosen words. He attended meetings remotely, turned down invitations, and learned the small but terrifying responsibility of being needed. The girls watched him closely, measuring his consistency in the way children do, not with questions but with silence. 3 months later, on an ordinary afternoon that promised nothing unusual, everything broke. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that makes roads slick without warning. The girls were in the back seat of the car, arguing softly about which movie to watch later, while Ethan sat beside the driver, reviewing messages on his phone. The impact came suddenly, metal screaming against metal, the world jolting violently out of alignment. The sound was sharp and final, followed by a moment of impossible stillness. When Ethan opened his eyes, his first thought was not pain or fear but their names, repeating in his mind like a prayer. Olivia. Lily. Sophie. Paramedics moved quickly, voices overlapping, hands steady and practiced. The girls were conscious, crying, calling for him. Ethan answered them over and over, telling them he was there, that everything would be okay, even as dread coiled tightly in his chest. At the hospital, time dissolved into white hallways and harsh lights. Doctors spoke in measured tones, careful not to promise anything too soon. Lily and Sophie had bruises and cuts, nothing life-threatening. Olivia did not wake up. She has a severe head injury, the doctor said quietly. We've done everything we can for now. The word coma echoed in Ethan's mind, hollow and unreal. He sat beside Olivia's bed as machines breathed and beeped around her, the smallness of her hand in his overwhelming him. Her face was pale, too still, stripped of the quiet strength she usually carried. He watched her chest rise and fall, terrified that if he looked away, it might stop. Lily and Sophie were taken home later that night by a caregiver, confused and frightened, asking questions Ethan could not answer. He stayed behind, refusing to leave Olivia, sleeping in a chair, his suit wrinkled and forgotten. Hours turned into days. Days into endless waiting. Ethan spoke to her constantly, telling her about Emma, about the stories her mother had written down, about the life they could still have if she stayed. He apologized aloud for things she might never hear, for every moment he had missed, for every promise he had broken before she ever knew his name. At night, when the ward grew quiet, fear pressed in on him more heavily. He imagined explaining loss to two children who had already buried their mother. He imagined their faces hardening, trust dissolving. The thought hollowed him out. For the first time in his life, Ethan prayed without pride or expectation. He prayed in broken sentences, offering anything he could think of in exchange for her waking. He promised change, humility, devotion, knowing none of it could be bargained, yet unable to stop. One evening, as rain streaked down the hospital windows again, he felt the weight of exhaustion finally pull at him. He rested his forehead against Olivia's hand, his voice barely audible. "I just found you," he whispered. "Please don't leave me now." The machines continued their steady rhythm, indifferent to his desperation. Ethan stayed where he was, holding on, realizing with painful clarity that this was the moment his strength, his wealth, and his control meant nothing at all. The doctors warned him not to expect miracles, yet Ethan continued to return to the hospital each morning with the same quiet hope he tried to hide from everyone else. Days blended together in a haze of antiseptic smells, muted conversations, and the soft beeping of machines that had become the background rhythm of his life. Lily and Sophie visited when they could, standing on either side of Olivia's bed, speaking to her in whispers as if raising their voices might break something fragile and unseen. 2 weeks passed without change. Then, on a morning that began no differently from the others, everything shifted. Ethan was seated beside the bed, reading aloud from Emma's diary, choosing the gentler entries, the ones filled with warmth and small victories. His voice was low and steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. When he reached the end of a paragraph, he felt a faint pressure against his fingers. He froze. At first, he thought it was his imagination, another trick of desperate hope, but then he felt it again. Olivia's fingers moved, barely, but undeniably real. "Olivia," he whispered, leaning forward. "I'm here." Her eyelashes fluttered, casting shadows against her pale skin. The room seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, with visible effort, her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then settling on his face as if trying to understand what she was seeing. "Daddy," she whispered. The word shattered him. Ethan let out a sound that was half laughter, half sob, gripping her hand as tears spilled freely down his face. Nurses rushed in, voices urgent but controlled, checking monitors, calling for the doctor. None of it mattered. She was awake. She was here. Lily and Sophie arrived later that day, bursting into the room with cautious excitement that quickly dissolved into tears when they saw Olivia conscious and smiling weakly at them. The three girls held hands, their fingers intertwined, a quiet, powerful circle of survival. That same evening, Ethan made decisions that would have once terrified him. He called his board, cancelled meetings, and authorized the sale of a significant portion of his company shares. When his advisors questioned him, he answered calmly, without explanation. For the first time, his choices were not driven by fear of loss but by clarity. He founded a charitable foundation in Emma Wilson's name within days, directing its mission toward supporting single mothers and children facing cancer, ensuring that no one would ever have to choose silence over survival again. It was not an attempt at redemption. It was a promise made tangible. When Olivia was finally discharged weeks later, the apartment no longer felt temporary. Ethan rearranged his life around the girls without resentment or hesitation. He learned how to tie hair ribbons, how to listen without interrupting, how to sit on the floor during movie nights even when his back protested. Late one night, long after the girls had fallen asleep, Ethan stood alone on the balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly below. He thought of Emma, of her quiet strength, of the love she had carried without recognition. He whispered her name into the night, not as an apology but as a vow. He had stopped running. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood that miracles were not sudden or loud. Sometimes they arrived in the soft opening of a child's eyes and the quiet certainty that from this moment on, he would never let go. The calm that followed Olivia's recovery did not last long. It never does when truth collides with the public eye. It began quietly, with a single leaked court document, then a photograph taken through the tinted window of Ethan's car as he helped the girls inside. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere, reshaped and sharpened by headlines that stripped it of nuance and mercy. A powerful CEO. 3 secret children. A dead woman left behind. Ethan watched the news in silence as Lily and Sophie played on the floor nearby, carefully shielding them from the screen with his body whenever he could. The words felt unreal, as if they belonged to someone else, yet every accusation landed with precision. Commentators speculated about motives, timelines, morality. They spoke of Emma as a footnote and of the girls as a scandal. The board of directors reacted swiftly. An emergency meeting was called, and for the first time since he had founded the company, Ethan entered the boardroom knowing the outcome might not be in his favor. The familiar table, once a symbol of control and authority, felt cold and distant. Faces he had trusted for years looked at him now with calculation rather than respect. "This situation damages the company's image," one of them said bluntly. "Your personal life has become a liability." Ethan listened without interrupting, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He had expected this. He had prepared for it in the quiet moments beside hospital beds and during sleepless nights on the couch outside his daughter's room. They asked him to step down. Temporarily, they said. For the good of the company. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady, lacking the sharp edge he once used to dominate negotiations. "I won't," he said. "And I won't pretend my daughters are a mistake to be hidden." The room fell silent. He explained his decision clearly, without defensiveness or apology. He would not separate his life into acceptable and inconvenient parts. He would not choose profit over people again. If the company required that kind of sacrifice, then it was no longer aligned with the man he had become. The vote passed without him. By the time he left the building, his resignation was already public. His net worth dropped dramatically within hours as markets reacted, numbers falling in ways that would have once terrified him. Now, they barely registered. What did register was Sophie's expression that evening when she overheard a fragment of conversation between 2 adults. "Is it our fault?" she asked quietly, her voice heavy with fear she tried to hide. Ethan knelt in front of her immediately, taking her small hands in his. "No," he said firmly. "Never. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Lily watched him carefully, her gaze sharper, older than her years. "You're not mad at us?" He shook his head, pulling all 3 girls into his arms, feeling their warmth, their reality. "I chose you," he said. "Every single time, I will choose you." The following weeks were difficult. The apartment was quieter, stripped of staff and excess. Some friends disappeared. Invitations stopped coming. Yet something unexpected happened in the space left behind. The girls laughed more freely. Meals became messier. Evenings stretched longer without interruptions. One afternoon, as they worked on homework at the kitchen table, Olivia looked up and smiled. "You're different now," she said. Ethan paused. "Is that a bad thing?" She shook her head. "No. You're here." The simplicity of the statement struck him harder than any headline. In losing the version of himself the world admired, he had gained something far more fragile and far more important. For the first time, Ethan Harper understood that love was not proven by success or sacrifice alone, but by staying when leaving would be easier. 5 years passed quietly, not in the way success is loud and visible, but in the steady rhythm of days that slowly knit themselves into a life. The house by the ocean was nothing like the penthouse Ethan once lived in. It was smaller, warmer, filled with light and the constant sound of movement. Windows were left open to the sea air, shoes were abandoned near the door, and laughter carried easily from room to room. The girls had grown taller, stronger, more certain of themselves. Olivia had lost her fear of hospitals and learned how to swim before she learned how to be afraid of the waves. Lily developed a habit of asking difficult questions, the kind that required thought rather than quick answers, while Sophie remained observant and gentle, expressing herself through drawings that covered the refrigerator in color. They argued, reconciled, and moved through life with the unspoken confidence of children who knew they were not alone. Ethan watched them from the porch as they ran along the beach, their voices blending with the sound of the ocean. They called for him, waving with sand-covered hands, and he answered without hesitation, rising to join them instead of watching from a distance. He no longer measured time in meetings or markets, but in sunsets and shared meals, in stories told before bed and mornings that began slowly. Inside the house, a framed photograph stood on the mantel. Emma smiled out from it, young and alive, her presence woven into the home not as a shadow but as a quiet companion. Fresh flowers sat beside the frame, replaced every week without reminder. Ethan spoke to her sometimes, not out of guilt, but out of gratitude for the love she had given their daughters and the strength she had shown when no one was there to witness it. The foundation bearing her name had grown beyond his expectations. What began as a promise became a network of support, reaching women and children who once stood where Emma had stood, alone and unseen. Ethan rarely spoke publicly about it. The work mattered more than recognition. That evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon and the girls collapsed onto the couch, tired and happy, Lily grew quiet. She glanced toward the photograph on the mantel, then back at Ethan. "Do you think Mom knows we're happy?" she asked. Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. He had learned not to rush moments like this. "I think she always knew," he said softly. "And I think she would be proud of you." Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, while Olivia smiled, her hand resting over his, strong and warm. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing through the open windows and stirring the curtains gently, as if the house itself were breathing. Later that night, long after the girls had gone to bed, Ethan stood alone by the shoreline. The moonlight reflected on the water, steady and unbroken. He thought of the man he had been, driven by fear and ambition, and of the man he had become through loss, love, and responsibility. The path between them had been painful, but it had led him here. For the first time, there was no sense of something missing. Ethan turned back toward the house, its lights glowing softly against the darkness, and felt a quiet certainty settle within him. The past had shaped him, but it no longer owned him. What remained was not regret, but a future built on presence, devotion, and a love that had finally learned how to stay.